This is our second class on community property. Pardon me. At the last class, one of the things I mentioned is that there were certain code sections in the Family Law Act which are by far the more heavily tested sections. And these are those sections here, and you want to be sure to know them. I encourage you to learn them read them and understand them, know exactly what they say rather than what somebody else said about them. These sections, I will mention very briefly what they're about. The Section 760 defines community property. You certainly need to know that definition. This is about community property, separate property. 781 deals with community estate personal injury damages, community estate personal injury damages. 852 is about making transmutations. If you want to give something to your spouse, when do you need a writing? So these are like I don't know what you call that. When do you need a writing to make a gift or a transmutation to your spouse, or whatever you want to call that? Section 910 is the liability of married persons for premarital debts. So this is about debts. 911 is more about debts. When is a married person liable for premarital debts? What do you do if a married person signs a loan? That is to say, one married person borrows money based on their separate property use, but the bank requires that the other spouse sign off also. That other spouse is not responsible in those cases, and that's what these sections are about. 911, 912 is about quasi-community property. When is quasi-community property liable for debts? 913 is more about debts, liability of separate property for debts. 914 is liability for necessities, that is to say, you have to support your spouse for their necessities of life. 915 is about support and obligations like child support. I have A and B here. It's actually all of them. So this is about support. 2581 is community estate personal injury damages again. Community estate personal injury damages. And 2640 and 2603, are those, did I get those right? I should have put 2603 ahead of 26. Oh, I see. I made a mistake. Yeah, that's what I thought I did. Yeah, this is wrong. Sorry. So 2581 and 2640, these go together. This is the Lucas material. And then 2603 is community estate personal injury damages, and 2641 is education. Okay. So I encourage you to learn about these, to read the code and really know them. Now, we're going to start with problems. We did an overview lecture last time, and we will begin with one of the problems that we didn't do last time. This is the problem from the February 03 bar. Henry and Wanda podiatry and the oil painting and such things from the February '03 bar. So let's go through the analysis of that. This problem begins, sit here. Problem begins at line 5. And at line 5 it says, Henry and Wanda were married in 1980 when both were students at the State X University. Okay? State X is a non-community property state. Now, obviously what we have coming up is the material on quasi-community property. Here it's section 912. 912 does not define 912 does not define quasi-community property. 912 simply says that quasi-community property is liable for debts to the same extent that community property is liable for the debts. But community property is defined as property which was acquired in a non-community property state in such a way that it would have been community property if it was acquired in California. So a person in Nebraska who works and earns money and who's married, earns money and puts it in the bank, although Nebraska may treat that as his or her separate property, when that person becomes domiciled in California, we call that stuff quasi-community property. No matter where it's located, whether it stays in Nebraska or you bring it to California, it is listed as called quasi-community property. Now, just because the person came across the state line and came into California, we can't suddenly change their ownership of property because they did that. And so, even though when they come to California we call that quasi-community property, it really doesn't make any difference until they do something where the courts have the right to affect the ownership of property. And the places where the courts have the right to affect the ownership of property is when people die and when people get divorced, or if people ask for a property settlement for the court to render a property settlement. So when people die, they cannot own property anymore, and so the courts decide who owns the property. Usually they do that by following the instructions of the will, or if there's no will, there's a statutory scheme as to what to do, and so the courts are in the act. So it's when the courts get in the act that they can change the ownership of property. And when people simply come to California from out of state, they come here, the courts have not gotten into the act, and simply driving across the state line will not be enough to affect the ownership of property. But if you get divorced here or someone dies here, then it might very well. So this property in State X, line 6 is a non-community property state, and it says that shortly after marriage, Henry graduated and obtained employment with a State X engineering firm. So they are living in State X, and Henry is working there, and they are acquiring property, but not in community property form. Line 7. Wanda gave birth to the couple's only child, and Henry and Wanda agreed that Wanda should quit her job and remain home to take care of the child. Okay, no problem. So Henry's the only one working, and in this state, this State X, it's not a community property state. So what happens is that Henry works, and Henry owns his own money. She doesn't own it. She has some rights in the money, some various kinds of rights that these states and women are not completely ripped off, just only partly. And so she still has some rights, but we're not required to know about those rights. But when if Henry and Wanda come to California, that's going to be quasi-CP. Let's continue. Line 9. They bought a house in State X using their savings for the down payment. Now those savings are going to be quasi-CP when they come to California, but let's keep going. So they bought a house using savings as a down payment and obtained a loan secured by a 20-year mortgage for the balance of the payments. Okay? Mortgage payments were subsequently paid from Henry's earnings. Okay, all that stuff would have been treated as community property in California. So when they come to California, we'll use the Quaysac community property rules. Line 11, the title to X's house was in Henry's name alone. Same thing. It doesn't matter whose name it's in. It's going to be a Quaysac CP. In California, if you take community property and you buy a property and put it in your name alone, it will still be community property. It doesn't matter whose name it's in. You go out and buy a car, for example, using community property and put the name of the car in your name alone, it's still community property. Most couples, when they go out and buy a car, if they pay cash for the car, they don't put it in both names. Just put it in one name or the other. It doesn't really matter. It's still community property. If you buy the car on time, the lender will probably want both names on the title just so that they can be assured they're going to get paid. But that's the only reason for that. Line 14. In 1990, Henry accepted a job from a California engineering firm. Okay? The couple moved to California with their child and rented out the State X house. Well, the State X house is going to be treated as Quaysac CP. Let's continue. We're now at line 17. Line 17. In 1992, now let's watch our times. 1992 is 12 years after the marriage. So line 5 tells us they got married in 1980. In 1990, they came to California, so this is 2 years later. In 1992, Wanda's uncle died and left her an oil painting. Okay, that's fine. That's going to be her separate property. Why is that going to be her separate property? Because Section 770 says the separate property is property acquired even during marriage, property acquired by a gift, bequest, devise, or descent, and the rent, profits, and issues therefrom. And so here, in 1992, Wanda's uncle died and left her the oil painting with an appraised value of $5,000. Okay, that's hers, and a small cabin located on a lake in California. Well, that's hers also. Line 18. Wanda took the painting to the cabin and hung it over a fireplace. Well, the painting is hers, the cabin is hers. The mere fact that she hung the painting over the fireplace does not convert the painting to real property. Okay, it's not even a fixture. It's not attached to the property or anything. It's just hanging on the wall. It's furniture, really. So the painting is very much personal property. Line 21. In 1993, now this is 3 years after they've come to California, 13 years into the marriage. In 1993, after reading a book entitled How to Avoid Probate, there are lots of books out there that tell you that, Henry persuaded Wanda to execute and record a deed conveying the lake cabin to Henry, and so let's read again. Henry persuaded Wanda to execute and record a deed which conveyed Blackacre, quote, to Henry and Wanda as joint tenants with the right of survivorship. So this was her separate cabin, and now she has conveyed the separate cabin to the two of them as joint tenants. And that's interesting. It looks like a gift that she's doing that. So, continuing, line 23. Wanda did so believing that the only effect of the conveyance would be to avoid probate. Well, we've got a problem here, because indeed this conveyance will avoid probate. Okay. But she didn't seem to realize that this would also convey the ownership of half of Blackacre to Henry right now. So Henry becomes an equal owner with Wanda in this cabin, even though it doesn't look like she intended to do that. Now, and so you can see the problem coming down the line. What's going to happen here? Well, one of the things you can do with this problem that you see coming down the line is that you can use this code section here at the Lucas, the 2581 and 2640 under Lucas. What does 2581 and 2640 do for us? Well, 2581 is the legislation that says over here so you can see that a little bit better. So 2581 says that if you acquire property during marriage in any joint form, okay, if you acquire property during marriage in joint form, and they just did this. The couple acquired this property as joint tenants with right of survivorship during marriage. So if you acquire property during marriage in any joint form, that it is presumed to be community property, for purposes of dissolution. So if there's a dissolution, this will be presumed to be community property. And then 2640, that's why these two go together, says, but you give back any separate property contributions to ownership to the person who provided the separate property. Well, here, Wanda provided separate property. She provided all of it. And so you give her back her separate property ownership, and so that means you give her back all of the cabin. However, if the cabin increases in value over the years, then the increased value will be community property, because the only thing Wanda is going to get back is her separate property contribution to ownership. And that was the value of the property at the time it was conveyed to the joint tenancy. So so that's one way to deal with this. But in that case, Wanda gets back the cabin, the value of the cabin at the time that it was conveyed, plus she'll get half of the community property, but you still end up with Henry getting half of the increase in value, half of the true community property component. And that's kind of a problem still. So one thing we can do is to use the Lucas legislation. It doesn't matter whether you call it Lucas, anti-Lucas. The people who call it anti-Lucas, it is the legislation that is designed to undo what happened to Mrs. Lucas. If you call it Lucas legislation, then you're saying this is really legislation about the Lucas case. And so either way you want to call it is really not critical. The important thing is to understand what it says. So under the Lucas type legislation, what we have is that they would return under the Lucas legislation 2640 says reimburse Wanda the value of the cabin at the time of the transfer with no interest, no consideration for the depreciation of money, just give it back to her exactly what she gave, and that was the value of the cabin at that time, plus, and then everything above that is community property, and she gets half of that. Now, are there any other ways we can deal with this? Yeah. One way to deal with it is to argue that Henry committed fraud, that he persuaded his spouse to give him half of the cabin. And if he did that, knowing what he was doing and he told her this would only affect probate. But did he really know better? We don't know. If he did, that's an intentional misrepresentation. It's fraud, and she can have the entire transaction rescinded for fraud. So that's the second way you might deal with the fact that he got her to transfer the property to the two of them. Another way you might deal with this is that RIPI says that RIPI, you may know, is the authority, is one of the national authorities on community property. RIPI is to community property what Perkins is to crimes, or Lafayette is to crimes, or what Prosser is to torts. And so RIPI says that you cannot create joint tenancy in property if neither party knows what joint tenancy means. If neither party knows, and they try to put something in joint tenancy, RIPI says it doesn't work. Certainly it doesn't work between husband and wife. And the reason it doesn't work, he says, because to create a joint tenancy requires three things: intent, a writing, and the four unities. To intend to create a joint tenancy, you have to intend to own the property in the way that joint tenancy means that you own it. You have to know what it means to own it in joint tenancy, and you have to intend to own it in that manner. Now, I don't mean to say that people have to be lawyers and have to know with, down to the ultimate detail what joint tenancy really means in a whole lot of strange situations. But so you don't have to know all that. But you do have to know the general idea of what joint tenancy means. It means you own the property together and survivor takes all. You got to know that much. And if you don't know enough about joint tenancy to intend to create that kind of a relationship, then these people you cannot form a joint tenancy if you don't know. Let me give you an example. It may seem a little strange, but suppose I want to, you and I are going to acquire some property, and I say, fine, let's acquire this property in Hackensack tenancy. In Hackensack tenancy, you say, okay. And so we acquire the property in Hackensack tenancy, and you really don't know what Hackensack tenancy is. Well, suppose in order to create the property, so you can't say you really intended to own it the way Hackensack tenancy says you own it. You didn't intend that. You have no idea what it means. Now let me tell you what it means. Hackensack tenancy means that you own 13% of the property, I own 11%, and the rest of it we promise to donate to the government in 5 years. And that's what Hackensack. Well, you don't know any of that. And so you can't say you intended to create that kind of a property relationship. All you heard was the word Hackensack. And so the same thing with joint tenancy. If you have no idea what it means, you can't really create the joint tenancy. So in applying that concept to this problem, you can see that if Henry is telling the truth, Henry doesn't know what joint tenancy means because he thinks it just avoids probate, but it does a lot more than that. She doesn't know what joint tenancy means because she thinks she's going by what Henry told her. So neither one of these people know what joint tenancy really means, and therefore, according to RIPI, they really cannot even create the joint tenancy. So the conveyance to joint tenancy arguably is either completely rescinded, or you might convert it to a tenancy in common, but more likely the courts would just rescind it altogether, saying this transaction did not happen. And if it did not happen, then that would save Wanda's property because she still owns it all. So those are the three ways you might deal with this transaction when Wanda signed the deed conveying her separate property to their joint tenancy property. Three ways you might deal with it are under the Lucas legislation, 2581 and 2640, or you might deal with it as a fraud by Henry, or you might say the transaction did not happen because of the rule that I just gave you. So continuing, we're now at line 26. In 1995, by the way, none of what we just talked about, none of that affects the painting that was hanging on the wall, okay? Because she conveyed the land. the cabin, and the painting is not the cabin, it's just hanging on the wall. In 1995, after 3 years of study paid for out of Henry's earnings, Wanda obtained a degree in podiatry and opened her own podiatry practice. And so here we have one spouse who went to school, substantially increased her earning capacity, the community paid for it, and that's here at 2641 where the details are, and the section we're talking about is at 2641C. 2641C is the key section that we'll be looking at, but read the whole thing. And so we have the community investing in her education. And now, after she has finished her education, she has substantially increased her earning capacity. Does she have to pay back the community? And the answer is, if the community stayed together for 10 years, there's a presumption that the community has gotten enough out of her education. Secondly, if her increased education, even if the community doesn't stay together for 10 years, they stay together for 1 month. If her increased education gives him the advantage that he no longer has to pay spousal support when he would have been able to pay, would have been required, but now she has enough earning capacity of her own so that he doesn't have to pay her spousal support, then that's another reason not to make her pay it back, because she's already gotten a benefit out of it. And so let's continue. It says, we are now at line 27. Her practice became quite successful because of her enthusiasm, skill, and willingness to work long hours. So here we've started a podiatry practice, and it's only started during marriage. There's no separate property contribution to it. It's all community property. She works long hours, etc. That doesn't matter. It's still all community property. And there's no separate property there just because she works long hours. But it does tell you that her enthusiasm, skill, and willingness to work long hours is what made the business successful. And I'm not sure that matters, but let's keep going. Henry continued to work for the engineering firm. That's fine. Line 31. In 2002, well, let's see where we are now. They get married in 1980. 2002 is 22 years later, and they came to California in 1990. They've been in California for 12 years, and the book in 1993 is when Henry read the book and she made the conveyance of the property, the cabin, and that's now 9 years ago. So the cabin's been in the community for has been transmuted for 9 years, and it's probably increased in value over that 9-year period. So if it increased in value in the 9-year period, you pay attention. What would you like to do about this? Well, one thing you'd like to do is to treat the whole conveyance as fraudulent, and that would give Wanda back her entire cabin. You might also treat it as a mistake and get the transaction rescinded for mistake and get her cabin back. You might also claim that the conveyance never occurred because neither party knew what joint tenancy was. That would get her cabin back. And finally, if you use the Lucas legislation, or anti-Lucas, whichever you wish to call it, if you use that legislation, then she would get the value of her cabin as it was 9 years ago, but the increase in value will be treated like community property, and she'll only get half of that. So that's where we stand. And the painting on the wall worth $5,000 was not affected by any of this. Back to line 26. In 2002, Henry and Wanda separated and filed for dissolution of marriage. Wanda had the painting appraised, and it's now worth $50,000. Well, that her painting is appraised now worth $50,000, and it doesn't matter. It's still hers. She didn't give it away. She didn't try to give it away. it was in the cabin, but it was never attached to the cabin. It's just hanging on the wall. And so that was her separate property. You explain why, and it still remains her separate property. Line 36. What are the respective rights of, number one, the lake cabin? Pardon me. The lake cabin. Well, we've just talked about the lake cabin. It was her separate property when she received it because of 770, and you recite 770 and explain to them that it's her separate property. But she then made a transmutation to joint tenancy, and that can be treated in any of the four ways that we just talked about. And she can either get it all back or get most of it back, depending on which way it's treated. Item 2, the painting. Well, the painting is her separate property because of 770, and it was not attached to the real estate. It's just hanging on the wall. It's furniture. It's personal property. There was never any attempt to make a transmutation of the separate property, and so that takes care of that. It's her separate property. The painting remains her separate property. Item 3, the state X house. Well, you've got to use some quasi-community property rules here, and you do them and point out that the state X house is quasi-community property. You point out that when these people became domiciled in California, that the property that's out of state was acquired out of state in a manner that would have been community property in California if they had acquired it that way in California. We treat that as quasi-community property when the property is brought before the court. When the property is not brought before the court, it really has no effect at all. When it's brought before the court, it's treated as quasi-community property, and quasi-community property is treated like community property for all purposes unless the non-owner dies. We'll come back to that in just a second. But so you still have to prove to the bar examiners that this house in State X was acquired in a manner that would have been community property if they acquired it here. It was his earnings and the credit and the note and all that sort of stuff. Just explain why all that would have been CP. Okay, and if all that is community property, or would have been, it's now quasi-community property. Upon dissolution, it gets divided half and half. And you might point out to the bar examiners that this property is in State X, and that the California courts really don't have the authority to redetermine the ownership of real property in State X. And so what the court can do is they can order Henry to convey her half of it. The court can give her some other property that the two of them own that's sufficient to compensate for her half of the community property in State X. Those are the main things that the court can do, and you should mention that. And that's what would happen regarding the house in State X. And finally, item 4, what professional education for podiatry practice, and that's the one that we apply 2642, that's the 2641, that's the education code, and the education code is one that says that if they stay together for 10 years, there's a presumption the community was adequately compensated. Well, how long did they stay together after she got her education? Well, she got her education in 1995 is when it was completed. And the dissolution is now about to happen in 2002. So that's only 7 years after she completed her education. So the presumption is that the community has not been adequately compensated, and she does have to pay back the cost of her education. But please be careful to note to the examiners that she only has to pay back the education cost, not her cost of living during the time she was getting educated. You don't have to pay back to the community for her food, her shelter, clothing, any of that stuff. Just the education expenses. Pay that back to the community. Secondly, so it's only been 7 years, so the presumption that the community has not been sufficiently compensated, therefore she should have to pay it back, unless she can rebut the presumption. Now, if she can show that the community got a lot out of her education during the 7 years that she remained married after she got a license, she may be able to rebut the presumption that the community has not sufficiently benefited. But all we know so far is that the practice became quite successful, and it became quite successful, and therefore, but we don't know if we don't have, we take a lot more details to rebut the presumption that that success was so great that you should treat the community as having been compensated for its education investment. So try to rebut the presumption. You don't really have the facts to do it with here. Finally, in 2002, Wanda and Henry, this line 31, Wanda and Henry separated in 2002, and so they separated in 2002, and this is a February 2003 bar exam question. So if you were taking the exam in February 2003, you don't know how much time Wanda continued to operate the podiatry practice after they separated. Because if the podiatry practice increased in value during that period of separation, then what do you do? How do you award that increase in value? Remember, the podiatry practice itself is community property because it was started during the community with community assets. So the podiatry practice was community property, and but even though the podiatry practice is community property, once they separate, her earnings from the practice are her separate property. But if the practice increases in value, to whom do you assign that increase or award that increase? And this one we use what's so-called reverse Pereira and Van Camp. And the rule is, again, that what you do is you determine the primary cause of that increase in value. Now, they tell you that she works hard and long hours, so probably her labor, which is separate property during the separation, her labor is probably the cause of the increase in value of the podiatry business, if it did increase. So since her labor is probably the cause, also a podiatry practice is not a heavy capital investment, it's mostly services. And so the increase in value, if one occurred, was probably primarily due to her labor. So you give all the increase to her labor, giving it to her, but first you must subtract interest on because her labor was using the community-owned business. And so when the community-owned business is basically out there being loaned to her, so to speak, in principle, when the community separated, they could have sold the business and put it in the bank and watched it grow at the interest rate, let's say 10%. And so the value of the podiatry business is community property, and the community is entitled to interest on that during this period when she is using it to earn her own living. So the community gets the value of the business and it gets interest on the money, since this is almost surely a case where the primary cause of the increase was her labor, not a lot of invested capital. That's how you would do it. That would be done under, that's called the Pereira rule, when the primary cause is labor. We call it the Van Camp rule when the primary cause is capital. Now, I know that besides the Van Camp and the Pereira rules, there's also stuff people call the reverse Pereira and the reverse Van Camp. Well, this very problem that we just finished doing would be a reverse Pereira rule. But you don't have to think of these in terms of forward and reverse and all that. Look at the public policy that is behind the rule. And there's one common public policy. Remember the public policy rather than the abstract rules. And the public policy is whatever estate, private, for personal property or community property estate, whichever of those two is primarily responsible. Well, first, what you look at is labor and capital. Was labor or capital the primary cause of the increase, which it was? Whichever one it was, labor or capital. If the labor is the primary cause of the increase, then whoever provided the labor gets all the increase minus what it takes to be fair to the person who provided the capital. And you give them back their capital and pay them interest. If capital is the primary cause of the increase, then you give all the increase to whoever provided the capital, but before you do that, you pay fair wages to whoever provided some labor. And that is the underlying policy, and it always applies. And that takes care of this problem from February '03. And what we want to do, we are a few minutes from our break. Rather than start a new problem and take the break in the middle of the problem, let's take a 10-minute break now, and then let's do the next problem.